We welcome Dr. Nick Andon joining us from London. Very good morning to Dr. Andon. Before Dr. Andon is giving his presentation, let me briefly introduce him to all of us. Dr. Nick Andon has rich experiences in teaching English as a foreign language in various countries. In Senegal, Indonesia, London, England, Oman. From 1993 to 1999, he worked in language at University and King College Algeria. Dr. Andon's PhD research investigates the relationship between theory and research in second language acquisition and language teachers and knowledge, beliefs and practices. He's currently researching the knowledge, beliefs, and practices of FML teachers in the United Kingdom. Dr. Andon's research interests include task-based language teaching, teacher development and expertise, the role of materials in language teaching and learning, learners' autonomy and learner strategy in language learning, focus on form of PBLT. Dr. Andon supervises a lot of PhDs on language teaching methodology and materials, teachers' beliefs, practices, and identities, also on language teaching policy and curriculum and language learner strategies. Dr. Andon, the time is yours.
Okay, is the audio clear enough?
On my side, yes, it's clear enough.
Okay, great. And you're going to share my PowerPoint from your side?
Yes, we are setting it online now, as we speak. Can you see your okay?
Fantastic. Great. Fantastic. Okay. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming here, and thank you to colleagues in Nusa Cendana University for inviting me to your webinar. I first came to Indonesia as a teacher in 1983, long before many of you were born. And in fact, I've been teaching English and writing materials and textbooks and training teachers for 40 years now. And it's been my great pleasure to witness the passion and dedication of colleagues in universities and schools in English language teaching over this time. I hope my talk today will be of some small help to teachers in university and to present and future teachers in schools. My topic is about something that's very close to my heart, the relationship between theory and research and our practice as teachers. What use is research? What benefit is research if it's not useful for teachers? I'm going to argue that this is a big problem, and I'm going to suggest a couple of ways that we can bring teachers and research closer together. Okay, so if we could have the next slide. This is just my abstract, but basically I would like to talk about what research is and what the value of research is for teachers and how teachers can make better use of research. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to start with two questions and maybe, yes, great. I'm going to start with two questions. Maybe just spend a few seconds thinking about those and thinking about your own opinions in relation to these questions, just for a few seconds. Okay, so here are some definitions of research. A key point that comes across is that research has to start with a question, or as David Noonan suggests, a problem or a theory, a hypothesis. And to find answers to this question or this problem, researchers need to be very organized, systematic and fair about the way they collect relevant data. Data or information, and also about the way they analyze that data. And the last point is quite interesting, and that is that Stenhouse says that research needs to be made public. If you don't communicate about what you find out, it's not really research. Okay, next slide. And one more. Is research useful to teachers? And is it useful for language teachers, for EFL teachers? This is a key question because a lot of teachers argue that research is not useful for them and they're not interested in research. And we're going to look at some of the reasons for that. And let's just say for now that research should be useful and it could be useful. And maybe it depends on a number of things like these questions here. Who is doing the research? Why is it being carried out? How is it being carried out? And what happens to research afterwards? Okay, next slide. And again, yes, thanks. That's great. Sorry about some of my slides are broken up. We should see the whole slide normally. Research really has two main purposes. The first one is to explain what's happening and why it's happening. For example, we might do research to find out why some learners are more successful than others, or why some students find it so hard to pronounce particular words. But a lot of research tries to develop some theories or some rules or some guidelines or principles that can guide teachers for the future. For example, is it better to correct students or to help them to correct themselves, or not to correct them at all? The answer to this question might help all teachers in future. So we aim to provide rules or theories to guide teachers about the best way to do things. And for this reason, research often compares different ways to do things. Okay, next slide, please. Our field of research related to English language teaching is called applied linguistics. And one thing that is certain is that there are mountains of research in our field, and it's one of the most dynamic and active fields in education science. Officially, the science of applied linguistics is about 70 years old. And right from the beginning, its main purpose was to understand foreign language teaching and foreign language learning better, and to provide answers to basic questions about how we can do a good job, how we can teach languages better. Since then, applied linguistics has broadened out into lots of different fields and professions. For example, medical communication, or multilingual and multicultural and intercultural communication, or super diverse cities, and so on. And within applied linguistics, we have a new field, a relatively new field of second language acquisition that comes back to this key point of how do we teach languages and how do we learn languages. And even we have a subfield of that, ISLA, Instructed Second Language Acquisition, that focuses on how languages are learned and taught in formal classroom settings and formal online learning settings. Okay, next slide, please. Carry it. Yes. Sorry about that. Great. So how can theory and research help us? It can provide teachers with evidence to build their own personal pedagogic principles. So rather than saying, you must teach like this, here are some ideas that help you to work out for yourself the best way to teach in your own context. The second point, it can also help teachers to see that some things they've always done might not be all that effective. And it may suggest things to do differently, things to try that are different from what you usually do. So research can make teachers change the way they teach. And one example is on the role of explicit and implicit learning, something I'll talk about in a minute. For example, on the question of age, on how old you should start, many people, including teachers, kind of assume that the younger you start learning a language, the better you will learn. And it makes common sense, we think. But actually, research shows that this is not true, and it's not a good idea. Children who start learning a bit later very quickly catch up. And in terms of multilingualism, we used to assume that it's better, for example, if you're teaching English, that you shouldn't speak any Indonesian in the classroom. It's a bad idea. But actually, research shows that we shouldn't stop children from using their L1 in the classroom. Sometimes it can be very helpful, and it's not necessarily a problem. And the third point is that understanding research and understanding theory gives us some tools to think about our own teaching and some language to discuss our own teaching with others. And finally, thinking about research and theories gives us a chance to think about our own principles and our own beliefs, perhaps ideas that we take for granted. And we can, without reflecting on why we think these things. So research helps teachers to reflect on what they do and teach. And I'll talk about that at the end. Okay, next slide, please. However, there is a problem. Researchers and teachers do not seem to talk to each other very well. They don't seem to communicate. They tend to ignore each other. Researchers probably feel frustrated that teachers don't pay enough attention to their research. And it's certainly true that most research has no effect on teaching. For example, research about presenting and practicing new language, or correcting errors, or the best age to start learning a language, or using the L1 in the L2 classroom, as I mentioned. So in spite of a lot of evidence for research that some things need to change, this does not happen very quickly, and sometimes it doesn't happen at all. Okay, next slide, please. So why don't teachers pay more attention to research? Well, I think there are lots of reasons, and here are some of them. The first one is time. Teachers are very busy. A teacher's work, as we know, is never finished. Preparing lessons, helping students, marking work. We usually wish we had more time to do these things, to do them better, let alone, read, study research, attend conferences. I know several teachers who have not just one job, but 2 or 3 jobs. A second problem is access to research materials. Books and journals are not usually available in schools. Very nicely, they usually are in universities. And if you have to buy your own, they're very expensive. And if you don't have access to the internet, that can also be a problem. And ideally, all teachers would attend conferences and carry on doing training courses throughout their careers. And maybe if you're lucky, attend a master's degree in another country or in Indonesia. But of course, this takes a lot of time, and also it costs a lot of money. I'm very happy that several Indonesian teachers have come to my university, King's College London, to do an MA, and they've been sponsored by LDPD, which is really good. But for most people, this is really, really expensive and impossible. And the last reason I think is very important. Reading about research is difficult and time consuming because of the way it's written. Researchers don't make their ideas as clear as they could. They use a lot of jargon or technical language. And some teachers say, well, that researchers aren't writing for me. They're just writing for their colleagues, for other researchers. They're not interested in teachers. They're not interested in being understood. In particular, a lot of research papers contain a lot of statistics and numbers, and many teachers struggle to understand this. I certainly do. Of course, researchers will argue they have to write in a certain way because they need to be precise and use precise language because the issues are complex, and for them, statistics are important. Okay, next slide. Carry on. Yeah, and of course, very importantly, a lot of teachers find that research is not very relevant to them, and here are some of the reasons. Firstly, research doesn't seem very practical to teachers. Teachers often say, that's all very well in theory, but how can I use this idea in my classes, in my lessons? It's possible that researchers don't actually know, or they're not very sure about how teachers can use their ideas. Or it may just be they're not very interested in teachers in communicating our ideas to teachers. But in my opinion, if we're doing research, it's for teachers, and it's really important that we keep teachers in mind. Research in our field looks at how languages are learned, but they often ignore some of the key things about lessons in classrooms. For example, children's behavior or children's motivation or the number of students in a class. These are the realities of your work as teachers, but researchers often ignore them. For example, the effects of motivation may be researched, but not many researchers look at how can teachers create motivation or build motivation. And a key point is that sometimes research doesn't investigate the questions and the issues that teachers are interested in. It often focuses on the questions that the researchers are interested in. Okay, next slide. This is just a summary of some of the points I've mentioned. I hope my PowerPoint can be made available to people afterwards. Okay, next slide, please. And go on. Thank you. So if there is a gap between theory and research, if teachers can't read the research or don't have time to teach the research, maybe it's the job of teacher educators, our colleagues in universities, people who train teachers. Maybe we're the ones who need to read the research and understand it, and then make it available to teachers in a simple, clear form. For example, we could train them to use a methodology like communicative language teaching, or to use intercultural learning or task-based language learning that's consistent with current research and theory. And part of what I hope to do today is to point out some things from research that all teachers need to know, but need to be presented with this information in a simple form. Yes, okay, thank you. Next slide. So one way to bridge the gap between theory and teaching is for applied linguists to design teaching methods for teachers to use, and to make it easy then for teachers to use that. A method or an approach starts with a theory of language and a theory of learning, and uses that to specify the syllabus, the materials, the teacher roles, the learner roles, the kind of activities that teachers should use that are consistent with what we know about how languages are learned. And we've seen that over the last 50 or so years. There've been a whole succession of approaches and methods that have tried to take research and theory into account. Some are quite serious ones, like the grammar translation method, which is still used in many contexts, or the audiolingual method. And I'm sure you know about communicative language teaching and task-based language teaching. Some of them are rather unusual, like the silent way, learning language with a silent teacher who doesn't say anything, or Suggestopedia, which is almost like hypnotism, hypnotizing your students to learn a language. Or I don't know if you've heard of Crazy English, which became very popular in China about 10 years ago. But the reality is that methods come and methods go. They seem to come into fashion and then out of fashion, and none really seem to be better than others in the end. Okay, next slide. And again, thank you. And a bit more. Okay, the one problem with approaches and methods is that methods that work in one context might not work in another. For example, communicative language teaching works very well in London with small classes of motivated adults from different countries together in the same class who all speak different languages. It might needs to be adapted a lot to work with children in large classes in Indonesia where everyone has the same first language, Indonesian or Javanese or something like that. Some methods are quite rigid. They're like recipes that teachers are supposed to follow, just like a recipe for cooking nasi goreng or opor ayam, my favorite Indonesian dish. And methods and approaches don't often tell teachers how they can adapt the method to their own different contexts. Of course, communicative language teaching and task-based language teaching are not really so rigid. In fact, they have many variations and it can be quite hard to understand exactly what you're supposed to do with them. Okay, next slide. Sorry, I'm looking at the time, checking my time, 16 minutes. And as my colleague and I wrote, one of the reasons why there's no straightforward recipe for teaching is that actually teaching is complex and learning a language is very complex. And we all teach in different contexts. We have different students, we're different teachers, we have different class sizes. Our learners are learning for different reasons. So there's no easy answer to the question, what's the best way to teach a language? What's the best way to teach my class? I would have to say, I don't know. Tell me about your class. Who are your learners? Why are they learning English? How much time do they have to learn? Who are the teachers? What are the resources? And lots of other questions that help us to make decisions. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, some people say that given that we all teach in different contexts, we should forget about training teachers to use particular methods. We should allow teachers to develop their own pedagogy. Well, that's really difficult though, especially for new teachers, if we don't give them any theory to guide them. It takes a long time to find out what works or what doesn't work well in your context. And it may be that we never discover for ourselves what works or not work. So without this kind of guidance from research and theory, teachers would probably just simply teach their pupils and their students in the same way that they were taught by their teachers 20 years before. And those teachers were probably trained 20 years before that. So nothing changes. We need research to help us to update and to change the way we teach. How can we really research what works well? Okay, next slide. So there are two solutions that I'm going to suggest. One is that teacher educators, like many of you, and also people like textbooks writers and syllabus designers, need to bridge the gap between research and practice by providing teachers with a clear set of simple, practical principles that can be discovered from reading research, principles that are flexible and adaptable to different contexts, so that teachers can take these but adapt them to their own context, to the needs of their learners, and so on. And the second solution I'm going to talk about is encouraging teachers to do their own research and to find out for themselves the best ways to implement these principles and to teach their learners in their context. Thank you. Next slide. Okay. So on the one hand, applied linguistics, especially second language acquisition and instructed second language acquisition, have all provided us with lots of information about how languages are learned, but not all of it's relevant. and not all of it is easy to understand or easy to put into practice in our lessons. So how can we find the most important parts of research and understand it? Next slide. One thing that research has told us is that simply explaining about language, explaining the rules of grammar, for example, to students, and maybe giving them some practice in using rules, does not mean that students are actually able to use language to communicate. On its own, explicit learning is not enough. If we just do this, students don't develop the ability to communicate in a language. People need to learn a language by using it to communicate. And it's agreed by most SLA researchers that we need to learn a language implicitly or unconsciously by just trying to communicate in language. In spite of this, most teachers, most textbooks, most language curriculum experts treat language as if it's just like any other subject, history or mathematics or science, that we just need to explain it to our students and then they'll know it. Okay, next slide. So traditional explicit approaches to language teaching means that for every lesson, the teacher or the textbook selects one language point and gives that to students by explaining and practicing. Each language point is like a brick given to the builder, and the builder's job is to put all these bricks together to make a wall. And with explicit approaches, it's the learner who's the builder. We give them a brick, and in their heads, they have to put all these bits of language together to build a language. And in every lesson, everyone knows what this piece of language is that's supposed to be learned. You probably know this as PPP, presentation, practice, and production. The teacher explains one brick, one piece of language to the class, and she gives them some practice activities. And finally, if there's enough time, she gives students the opportunity to actually communicate using this new language. Unfortunately, not all the students in the class might be ready for that particular brick or that particular piece of language. And putting these bits of language together in your brain is not so simple as building a wall with bricks. And besides, often there isn't enough time in class to practice actually using this language to communicate for the practical purpose of communication. And I would say lastly that whoever built this wall is not a very good builder. It's not very straight. Okay, next slide. So implicit learning, for example, as we have in task-based language teaching, is very different. It works in the opposite way to explicit learning and PPP. You start off with communicating, giving students a text to read or a task to do. For example, to find out something from your classmates, or to work together to solve a problem, or to make a decision, or to choose the right person for a job, for example. So students start by trying their best to communicate or to solve the problem. And after they've done that, after they've completed the task, then the teacher helps them to fix any language problems they had, or correct their mistakes, or find better ways to do things. And this is often called task-based language teaching, and it's an implicit approach. It's learning by doing, or learning to communicate by communicating. Why have I put a picture of a swimming pool? Sometimes this is called a deep end approach. It's like teaching a child to swim by throwing them into the deep end of the swimming pool, and they might drown, but they might learn to swim, and then you can help them and give them some suggestions. But that's quite scary, isn't it? Although this little boy doesn't look very frightened, he looks quite happy. He's already learned to swim, maybe. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about task-based language teaching because it's something I'm very interested in, and I think it's something teachers should know about. Next slide, please. So what is a task? What are these opportunities for communicating that we should provide teachers with? So I think in a very clear definition, Rod Ellis and Natsuko Shintani provided 4 key characteristics of a task. And the first one I think is really important, that the primary focus of the lesson should be on meaning, so that learners should be mostly focused on communicating something in the lesson and not focused on language for most of the time. There needs to be some kind of gap or problem, some kind of need to convey information or to communicate, to express your opinion or to work out some meaning. The third one is really important and quite controversial. It says that actually learners should rely on what they already know, the language they already know, and the ideas they already have in their head in order to complete the language. That is, we don't teach them the language they need to perform the task, although they might be able to borrow some language from what we talk about before the task or anything we ask them to read to prepare them for the task. They might be able to pick up some language from that. The fourth one is really important. There has to be some kind of outcome, some kind of problem to solve or some kind of decision to be made, so that when learners are performing the task, their main focus is on communicating and their ideas and not on the language they use. They shouldn't worry about making mistakes, for example. The last point is a small one, and that is that doing the task should be really like communicating in the real world. So we should think about what kind of things people do with language in the real world and try to bring that into the classroom. Thank you. Next slide. Here are just some examples of tasks that you probably know about and have used. They're little activities that you can give students to do in a classroom. And I'm sure you all do some of these. But I think the main thing about task-based learning is we start by asking students to do the task without necessarily teaching them all the language at the beginning. We can go back and teach them some of the language afterwards and help them. And maybe they could do the task a second time and see if they do it better. Thank you. Next slide. So to sum up, task-based language learning is an implicit approach, and an implicit approach starts from the idea that people learn language best without thinking about language. They learn a language by using it to communicate. And strong versions of communicative language teaching, like task-based language teaching, try to follow an implicit approach. In the classroom, learners try to understand what they're reading or listening to, and they try to communicate through speaking their own meanings, and the language is picked up subconsciously without really focusing on it. It develops naturally. And this type of approach is known as focus on meanings, or FOM. But task-based language teaching tries to combine focus on meanings with focus on form as well. Okay, next slide, please. How am I doing for time? I think I've had about 30 minutes, another 15 minutes.
You're doing fine. You have still like 8 minutes for your presentations, roughly.
Okay. All right. Okay. I'll speed up a little bit. I really want to point out the Ellis Principles that were designed by Rod Ellis in New Zealand to provide some simple and key principles to teachers. And these have been adopted in New Zealand for training teachers. And these fit very well with a task-based, communicative and implicit approach. But these really provide some general guidelines to say, what do we know about research that might be useful for teachers, but they can use in their own way adaptively. And from reading all the research on SLA, Rod Ellis came up with these principles. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the ones I think are most important. Next slide, please. Yeah, go on. So the first one is that instruction, lessons need to ensure that learners focus mostly on meaning. Most of the time in lessons should be about communicating something real and something interesting with each other, between the students and with the teacher. But we also need to make sure that we do spend some time focusing on form, explaining grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, communication strategies, intercultural communication, and so on. But just don't spend too long on it, and don't teach language without moving on to practicing communication. The third point's an interesting one. Successful instructed language learning requires lots of input. Learners need to read a lot and hear a lot of the target language. Next slide. Good one. Thank you. So learners also need not just to read and listen to a lot, but they need to speak a lot and they need to write a lot. And don't forget, if the main focus is on meaning, when students are speaking and when they're writing, they need to be writing something meaningful and saying something meaningful so that another person understands them. They need to be communicating their ideas. And interaction is also important. When learners talk or write, they need to have something to communicate, and they need to work hard so that the person they're talking to can understand them. The next one is perhaps very quickly. Actually, learners are all different, and when we teach them, we need to realize that they learn things in different ways and in different order. Next slide. This is some more of his less important principles, but the first one I think is quite important. Sometimes we need to learn lots of set expressions, like, for example, how are you today, or what I think is, or I would like. We learn chunks of language and so on. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Okay, I really recommend these principles, but I want to argue that principles are quite a flexible guide for teachers. They tell us some of the most important things that we can learn from research, but they don't tell teachers what to do. They provide a starting point for teachers to plan what to do and to carry out the plan. So one principle can be put into practice in many different ways to match the context and the needs of the learners and the teachers. And we can also use these principles to evaluate or think about what we do and to adapt materials, to adapt methodology, to adapt our lessons. And actually, you don't have to follow all the principles. You may decide that some principles are not very relevant to my context. They're not laws that you have to follow. They're just some guidelines that may help teachers to think. Thank you. Next slide. I think I'll pass over this, but I just point out that this text from a recent British textbook is really terrible because it's not a real text. It's very short. It was written for the textbook, and actually it doesn't provide students with a focus on meaning because it's a silly text. It's not real. Okay, next slide. When we look at that piece of material using these principles and maybe look back on it another time, does it provide students with extensive exposure to language? No, it's not. It's very short, and the text is not at all authentic. It's not like English or German in the real world. Does it focus on meaning? No, because the meanings are not real or true. They're not interesting. There's nothing to understand about the text because it's just a made-up text and it's not like real English. Does it focus on form? Yes, it does, probably, because in this students are practicing the present tense and they're practicing vocabulary and so on. Does it cater for individual differences? No, everyone has to learn the same thing at the same time. Does it provide opportunities for output? Maybe learners could talk about their own activities, but actually the text doesn't provide a very good or realistic model. Okay, moving on. Next slide. If you've ever been to London, you might recognize this expression, mind the gap, when you're on the underground train. You'll hear this because sometimes there's a gap between the platform and the train, and you have to be careful, otherwise you'll fall down the hole, and that would be very dangerous. But rather than saying, oh, there's a gap and somebody needs to help teachers, we could say it might be a better idea to close the gap, to bring these two sides, researchers and teachers, closer together, and so on. Next slide. Press again, please. One more. Sorry, go back. So there's research or teach, or sometimes called exploratory practice in my last part of my presentation. This is another way to make a kind of bridge between research and teaching. This is the idea that teachers should also do research, and that they should research their own teaching and their own lessons and their own students. Sometimes this is called action research or participatory research or teacher research. Thank you. Next slide. Here are some definitions of teacher research, and I'll perhaps allow you to read them, but it's very important. They're about teachers addressing questions in their own practice. Next slide. So here are some ideas about what action research is. It's research that's carried out to inform the action of teachers. It's very practical, and that's why it's called action research. It's usually very small scale research in your own context, uses case study, it can use statistics, but very often it uses qualitative descriptions and so on. And teachers use action research so they're not just relying on guesses or intuition, but have reliable data about what's happening in their classroom. And you should be able to tell other people how you carried out that research. Thank you. Next slide. Go on. Thank you. So action research has a kind of cycle of steps. It starts always with identifying a problem or puzzle. For example, why don't students speak very much in my classes? Or even if I keep correcting my students, why do they keep making the same mistakes? And the second stage is then to think about that problem. Well, what exactly do I mean by my students don't speak very much in the class? What is happening? Is it that nobody speaks, or that some of the students are speaking, but some of them are quiet, or that sometimes students speak, but sometimes when I want them to speak, they don't? Why is that? Maybe you could ask the students, or maybe you could get a colleague to come into your class to really see what's going on. You could say, I get the impression that most of my students aren't talking very much, but could you come into my class and keep an eye on them and maybe make some notes for me? Once you have a good idea what's actually going on in your classroom, the next thing is to do some reading and see if you can see some suggestions or some solutions in work done by other teachers or other researchers. You can look in books, you can research online, you can talk to your colleagues and see if you can come up with some new ideas. And then the next stage is to try something different, to design an intervention, and then you put that into practice in your classroom. And again, try to be careful about seeing. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can still hear you.
Yeah, my internet seems to be okay. To actually gather data, right. My connection is good.
You're doing fine, Dr. Andon.
Okay. And again, try something different and see what's going on. And lastly, you need to go away and think about what you've learned, what changed, and share the research. And then very often at the end of that, you start again, possibly because the research has shown you something different, or possibly because it hasn't worked and you need to try something else. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and I think the Ellis Principles I talked about, the 10 principles, can be really useful for action research. For example, you could think about this question about focusing on meaning, and you could record your lesson, find out how much of the time in your lesson are you and your students focusing on meaning, and how much are you focusing on language and form and explicit teaching. And for example, you could ask the question, do my students get to express their own ideas in my lesson, and how much? Or you could look at the question of extensive exposure, or how much output students produce in a lesson. or individual differences, or focus on form or correction. So you can use the Ellis Principles to choose a focus for action research. Thank you. Next slide. Given that researchers can't tell you all the answers and don't know about your classroom, it seems to make sense that teachers should be in control of research as well as in terms of their own classroom. Teachers need to be professionals who think for themselves, who make their own decisions. And as a result of that, teachers can carry on learning to be better teachers throughout their careers. I think action research is very powerful. Next slide. I'm coming to the end now. Yeah, teacher education isn't simply a matter of training teachers at the beginning of their careers, and this will equip them with all they need to know. Exactly 40 years ago, I finished my first training. It was a 4-week course called the CELTA. And then I started teaching. At that point, I knew nothing, but throughout my career, I've learned from my students, from my colleagues. I've done a diploma, I've done a master's, I've done a PhD, but action research can help all teachers to carry on developing and become independent professionals. Okay, I think probably it's a good time to stop now and answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Andon. Can you hear me well? Because I feel like I am having a delay in my audio.
I can hear fine.
Okay, great. There are a couple of questions. First, I should read the question from Agus Semyon. Because I see your presentations on the mind the gap issue. The question from Agus Semyon is that how can teachers apply new research findings in ELT teaching if reports of those research comes in form of articles published in reputable journals like Scopus and etc. But teachers need to pay first to read, especially in the context of Indonesia, where teachers are of low economy.
Yeah, no, I think this is a real problem, and I also think it's a big scandal, really, because the money that comes into universities in applied linguistics comes from teachers who pay to come on masters, and I think we have a duty to communicate more clearly to them and to make our research available to them. I think what is really good is that more and more research is available on the internet for free. And at the end of my presentation, I didn't get to that slide, but I provided some links to lots of really free materials that are available for teachers. For example, from the British Council in the UK, including a very nice free book that you can download on action research, and also from the Center for Applied Linguistics in America, which provides very short and very easy to read 1- or 2-page articles about different aspects of research that are, I think, quite accessible to teachers. And I also think it's really useful if teachers can form groups with their colleagues or form teachers associations locally, and maybe that's a good chance to get together and to read a piece of research and to discuss together how that research might be useful in your own contexts. And another suggestion is that teachers can get together and work together to do action research projects together. Very often it can really be effective if 2 or 3 or 4 teachers get together and work on an action research project together. I don't know if that answers your question, but there are more and more free resources, but it still takes a lot of work from teachers to understand them and apply them. And I think collaboration between teachers can be really, really helpful.
Thank you. I think it will somehow sufficiently answer the question. The next question comes from Gregorius Stephanus concerning methods and approaches. In his experiences, methods and approaches are 2 items that can't be separated, but however, he thinks that from his learning experiences, many approaches and methods are not really work or doesn't really work in high schools. What do you think about two-way communications? Is that helps us a lot?
Between researchers and teachers? Or?
Approaches and methods, and also about two-way communications in between.
Yes. I think researchers and methods do suffer from a lot of difficulties. And when I wrote that article with my colleague, I was arguing that it's really important for teachers to learn about methods and approaches like grammar translation and communicative language teaching and task-based language teaching, for example, not so that teachers are told, here is one method, this is what we use in Indonesia, you have to learn how to do this method well. But I think rather it would be helpful if all teachers knew about several methods so that they were able to draw on them flexibly and use a bit of one and a bit of another and try to combine these. But that's really difficult because you need to understand not just the method, but you need to understand the theories and the principles that underlie it. And learning lots of different methods and how to apply them is very time consuming. So now really I've gone to moving towards this new idea that I learnt about from our colleague Rod Ellis about principles. And I think principles are more general guidelines that teachers can apply more flexibly, and you can relate these principles to approaches and methods. But I've kind of turned my back on approaches and methods and said, let's teach principles to teachers, and then as we're training teachers, ask them to look at materials or look at lessons or recordings of lessons or look at your own lesson and see how those principles are being put into practice. And I think in a way that's more powerful. I think the idea of approaches and methods is problematic. A researcher in America, Professor Kumaravadi Velu, has talked about the fact we should throw methods away. He says we're in the post-methods era where people don't follow methods anymore. But I think you can't just leave teachers on their own with no guidelines. And I think where we had approaches and methods before, now perhaps we have principles to guide teachers in a more flexible way.
Okay, since you touched the issue of teaching teachers principles, so, as the best way to answer the limitations of methods and researches or approaches, there are questions though from several participants regarding the current conditions of the pandemic that we are facing, that people or teachers are expected to teach online. How those things can be facilitated? For instance, one participant asked a question of dealing with students with low abilities, or that online circumstances limit the personal interaction between teachers and students. Of all these questions, how do you think from your?
I think it's a really difficult problem, and I can only talk about my own experience. When we suddenly had to start teaching online in April 2020, we all found it very difficult. We found it hard work, but in some ways it had a lot of advantages. Instead of getting students together to come to class and giving lectures, we recorded our lectures in advance and sent those to students. And we also asked students to do things for themselves. For example, something I've always liked is to give students something to read before a lecture with some questions, and to ask students to get together in groups and discuss these questions and discuss what they've read. And then when we came together, like today on Zoom, the students had already done some reading. They'd already discussed the ideas or the research together in groups. They'd already listened to my lecture, and they liked that because they could listen 2 or 3 times if necessary. And then when we came together, they were able to ask questions or say, can you say a bit more about this because I don't understand this? Or they were able to give their own ideas. So this is what Tamzil talked about, flipped learning. I think flipped learning is really very powerful, and it's something I learnt about when we did some distance learning with teachers in Argentina in 1997 and onwards. And I've always thought it was a good idea, but very time consuming and very difficult to do. And when the pandemic came, we were forced to do this. And I must admit, we were forced to do something that I always believed we should have been doing anyway. Also on the chat, I put a link to my colleague, Russell Stannard, who was very helpful when we started doing this, because he's an expert on flipped learning and on online learning. And his YouTube videos I found really, really interesting about the technology, but also about the pedagogy for online learning.
Excellent. So this will be the last question for you. How important research is for teachers? Does research help teachers to consider the best method for their students, in your opinion?
I think it should be very important. I think, unfortunately, it's been very disappointing, and that researchers haven't always come up with the practical information that teachers need. And sometimes the research is really unclear about what teachers should do. Interesting, but actually not practical. So I think sometimes we need practical principles to bridge the gap, and we need teachers to be aware that research doesn't give you all the answers. You need to take responsibility for your own research and for interpreting research yourself. So it's a very hard job for teachers, but there are some things in research that you can draw on. I strongly recommend to all my students the Ellis Principles. I found these one way to bridge the gap, but I would also say to teachers, it's up to you to research for yourself in your own classroom how these principles might work where you teach.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Andon. It's very insightful for us of what have you shared with us. We really appreciate you to provide your time early on Saturday morning in London to give us some relevant issues for the teachers and also for students for their upcoming future career as teachers. Thank you very much. Without being respectful, we are going to move to the third speaker. Thank you very much.
Just to say, I'm very happy to answer any other questions by email later.
Sure. Thank you very much for your time. We'll keep you updated on things. Thank you very much.